200 tons of watermelons lowered into the desert sands of the Sahel. Not wasted, not accidental, deliberate, strategic. A gesture that stunned both friends and critics of Burkina Faso alike. At first glance, it looked like madness. A hungry nation burying food where children still go to bed unfed. Western headlines scoffed, analysts mocked, and commentators dismissed it as theater. But the government under President Ibrahim Traoré declared something else entirely. This was not about fruit. It was about soil. It was about sovereignty. It was about whether Africa would forever buy fertility at a price set abroad, or learn to grow it from its own waste, its own resilience, its own hands. Within weeks, whispers began to spread. Soil that once cracked now held moisture. Shoots that once failed now pierced the dust. What began as ridicule was shifting into unease. Because if 200 tons of discarded melons could breathe life into barren land, what else might it awaken? Do not turn away. What follows may reshape not only the fate of Burkina Faso, but the meaning of independence itself. Subscribe and stay with us. They called it reckless. They called it waste. But to the people of Burkina Faso, the act of burying more than 200 tons of watermelons in the blistering sands of the Sahel was neither ritual nor folly. It was survival disguised as defiance. It was the beginning of a story the world had not expected. The operation began without cameras or fanfare. Trucks rattled through narrow provincial roads, stacked high with cracked, overripe watermelons that could no longer find their way to market stalls. Farmers, extension workers, and government teams dug pits into the sun-scorched earth, lowering the fruit into the ground as though sowing seeds of another kind. To passers-by, it looked absurd, food vanishing into dust. But to those who had been briefed, it was the birth of what would soon be called Project Oasis. The logic was both simple and radical. Watermelons, made of more than 90% water, are not only fruit but reservoirs wrapped in green skin. Rich in potassium, calcium, magnesium, and carbon, they promised a slow release of moisture and minerals if allowed to decompose underground. As officials explained, rotting fruit could become sponges beneath the earth, reviving microbial life and coaxing fertility back into soils long stripped bare by drought and erosion. Early trials offered a glimpse of promise. Independent agronomists measured plots where melons had been buried and compared them with untreated fields. The difference was striking. Moisture lingered nearly 2 weeks after rainfall in treated soil, while in control plots it disappeared within 4 days. Millet seedlings, long stubborn in the dust, sprouted nearly twice as fast, sending their roots deeper into the rehydrated earth. The numbers were modest, but the symbolism was immense. The desert was no longer silent. President Ibrahim Traoré himself framed the project in language that carried beyond agronomy. In a national address earlier this year, he spoke not of compost or microbial respiration, but of freedom. "If the world will not sell us fertilizer without chains," he declared, "then we will create fertility with what our land already gives us." His words landed with force. For decades, Burkina Faso's planting cycles had depended on expensive imports, chemical fertilizers shipped from Europe, purchased through aid packages, bound with conditions. A missed shipment, a contract dispute, or a political rupture often meant barren harvests. The fragility was not only in the soil, but in the system itself. Project Oasis was designed to shatter that fragility. What outsiders dismissed as a desperate stunt was in fact a calculated pilot, an experiment in resilience and autonomy. And watermelons were only the beginning. Officials hinted at the possibilities. Mango skins, citrus peels, peanut shells, millet husks, the detritus of harvests that usually rotted in markets or clogged depots. If buried with care, each could become another tool to rebuild the land. Not everyone was convinced. Skeptics in urban centers questioned the logic of burying food while hunger persisted. Opposition politicians demanded transparency, warning of pests, uneven nutrient release, even methane emissions if decomposition was poorly managed. Yet government scientists countered with data. Respiration tests showing microbial activity in treated plots had risen by more than 1/3 in a single season, and soil organic matter had begun to climb. For the Ministry of Finance, the calculation was not merely ecological but economic. Preliminary reports projected that even partial adoption of organic burial methods could reduce fertilizer imports by 15% within 5 years, saving tens of millions of dollars. Those funds, officials promised, could be redirected toward electrification, healthcare, and schools in the countryside. And so what began as a curious experiment slowly revealed itself as a declaration of independence. It was not just about crops, but about contracts. Not just about melons, but about models of development. In place of dependence on bags of chemicals branded with foreign insignia, Burkina Faso was proposing a low-tech, decentralized alternative rooted in adaptation rather than acceleration. It was a message written into the soil itself, that even waste could be transformed into wealth, and that sovereignty could be grown from below. The first shoots rising from melon-treated plots were more than botanical. They were political. They whispered of a future where farmers might trust their own compost more than cargo ships, where resilience might be measured not in aid flows, but in the greening of forgotten fields. But if seeds can sprout quietly, so too can storms gather unseen. What began as a modest burial of wasted fruit was about to unearth something far larger, a confrontation that reached beyond fields and into the heart of global power. The silence of buried fruit did not last long. 6 weeks after the first pits were filled, a memo leaked from a European Agricultural Trade Association. Its language was not scientific but strategic, urgent, alarmed, and dripping with fear. It warned that if Burkina Faso's melon burial method proved effective and scalable, it could undermine billions in fertilizer sales across West Africa. Contracts could collapse, supply chains could fracture, influence could be lost. But the most revealing line was this: the narrative must be controlled. Not experiments, not data, not agronomy, narrative. Within days, the shift became visible. Where once newspapers in London and New York had published mocking cartoons, they now printed pointed accusations. Headlines branded Project Oasis as reckless populism, a dangerous stunt, a smokescreen for deeper failures. One American op-ed even suggested the initiative masked corruption or foreign interference. Another warned of turning Burkina Faso's population into guinea pigs for unproven science. At home, the fallout was electric. Opposition leaders seized the moment, demanding audits and investigations. Protesters in Ouagadougou carried placards reading, "Where is our food?" and "Where is the truth?" Skepticism surged in cities, where images of truckloads of melons disappearing into desert pits felt distant and incomprehensible. Yet in the countryside, a different current was rising. Farmers close to the pilot plots had seen the change with their own eyes. In the village of Liptugu, a former border guard named Soline told his community, "We used to guard borders. Now we guard the soil. One protects territory, the other protects the future." His words traveled through radio waves and marketplace chatter, transforming doubt into pride. Across the northern provinces, grassroots energy began to swell. Women's cooperatives organized melon days, collecting spoiled fruit from market stalls to bury systematically in fields. Youth groups mapped burial sites, measured moisture, and reported findings. Teachers turned the practice into lessons, telling children to plant water as they lowered melons into the soil. What had begun as a government pilot was quietly morphing into a movement. But the international campaign did not relent. Fertilizer lobbyists increased their presence on television, warning of biosecurity risks. Think tanks funded by European trade interests released reports portraying Project Oasis as a hazard. Donor agencies delayed disbursements for unrelated agricultural programs, citing concerns over Burkina Faso's experimental policy direction. Aid was no longer neutral, it was leverage. The government responded with calculated precision. In a televised address, the Minister of Agriculture stood before two photographs. On the left, cracked barren soil from a control plot. On the right, a green patch where melons had been buried. "This is not theater," she declared. "This is evidence, and evidence does not require permission." Independent scientists from regional universities began publishing preliminary data confirming increases of more than 35% in microbial activity and 40% higher germination rates for millet and cowpeas. These figures did not silence critics, but they shifted the ground beneath the debate. Skepticism now had to wrestle with facts sprouting visibly from the Sahel. Meanwhile, the symbolism of Project Oasis began to resonate beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In Mali, callers to radio stations asked whether surplus baobab pulp could be used the same way. In Chad, village leaders requested technical visits from Burkina agronomists. In Senegal, an agricultural college launched a national competition for organic soil amendments inspired by the watermelon burial. What started as ridicule in foreign headlines was becoming a source of experimentation in neighboring lands. Still, the backlash deepened in Western capitals. Behind closed doors in Washington and Brussels, officials avoided public comment but flagged the project in diplomatic briefings. The anxiety was clear. This was no longer about melons. It was about the precedent they set. If a low-tech burial of spoiled fruit could challenge the dominance of billion-dollar fertilizer markets, what other dependencies might crumble? In Ouagadougou's streets, murals began to appear. Green fists breaking chains, vines sprouting from buried melons. Folk songs celebrated the water beneath the dust. Protest chants in unrelated rallies borrowed imagery from Project Oasis, turning agriculture into anthem. The stakes had escalated far beyond soil science. This was no longer a question of whether melons decomposed. It was about who controlled the story of survival. Dependence or dignity, imports or innovation, and as the ridicule gave way to resistance, one truth became unavoidable. Project Oasis was no longer just an experiment in Burkina Faso. It was fast becoming a battleground over the very meaning of sovereignty. The consequences of Project Oasis were felt first not in parliaments or press rooms, but in households. In towns like Kaya and Fada, women's groups who had once struggled to sell spoiled produce began organizing melon days. They gathered damaged fruit from market stalls, mixed pulp with crop residues and charcoal dust, and produced compost-like amendments. These were sold in small batches to neighboring villages, with profits reinvested in schools, water wells, and lanterns. Waste was no longer waste, it was wealth reimagined. Young men who might have migrated to Ouagadougou or further afield stayed behind, picking up shovels instead of bus tickets. They dug pits, measured moisture, and monitored results. Teachers built lesson plans around the science of water retention, sending children to bury melons in demonstration fields. Pupils called it planting water. For them, the symbolism mattered as much as the science, that even what looked ruined could restore what was thought lost. Farmers, long resigned to failed harvests, began to see soil differently. A mother in Cupola told visiting reporters she had saved 1/5 of her farming costs in a single season by relying less on imported fertilizer. With those savings, she bought uniforms for her children and a solar lantern for night study. Holding up her daughter's backpack, she declared, "The melon gave us this." Such testimonies signaled more than improved yields. They revealed a shift in confidence. For decades, Burkina farmers had been taught that salvation arrived in bags stamped with foreign logos, carried on trucks from abroad, financed by donors whose conditions determined the rhythms of planting and harvesting. Project Oasis inverted that narrative. Fertility was not purchased, it was produced. Solutions were no longer scripted in Brussels or Washington, but improvised in dusty fields by those who lived the consequences. Politically, the ripple effects were immediate. Opposition leaders who had initially dismissed the project as reckless populism began softening their tone. Civil society organizations demanded environmental monitoring and transparency in costs, but they also admitted that the initiative had succeeded in galvanizing community engagement. The very critics who once scoffed were now recalibrating their arguments. The government seized momentum. Regional officials were tasked with identifying other biodegradable waste streams suitable for burial: mango skins, citrus peels, groundnut shells, livestock manure. A database was created to track moisture levels and microbial indicators across trial sites. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Finance published preliminary economic modeling: a 15% reduction in fertilizer imports over 5 years, equating to tens of millions of dollars in savings. For a fragile economy, these figures represented not only fiscal relief, but also a rebalancing of sovereignty. The cultural resonance was no less significant. Graffiti in Ouagadougou showed vines breaking through chains. Folk musicians sang of the water beneath the dust. Market vendors began to joke that spoiled fruit had become Burkina's new gold. A movement was emerging, part science, part survival, part symbolism. At the heart of this transformation stood the figure of President Ibrahim Traoré. To many rural families, his willingness to champion an unorthodox solution marked him not only as a head of state, but as a symbol of African leadership that refused to be defined by dependency or dictated by distant capitals. Whether in radio broadcasts or in classrooms, his message was repeated: "We will build fertility from what we already hold." Yet doubts remained. Urban protesters questioned whether melons could feed cities of millions. Scientists cautioned about methane emissions and pest risks. International donors continued to stall disbursements, signaling that political costs could follow agricultural defiance. Project Oasis was gaining legitimacy at home, but it was also sharpening tensions abroad. And therein lay the paradox. Each seedling sprouting in the Sahel carried with it both hope and danger. Hope that degraded land could live again. Danger that the system of dependence might not quietly surrender. The question was no longer whether Burkina Faso could sustain Project Oasis, but whether the wider world would allow it to flourish or conspire to bury it deeper than any melon. Abroad, the echoes of Project Oasis spread faster than its roots. In Brussels, the tone was sharp and unsettled. Policy briefings warned of non-standard practices destabilizing regional markets. Think tanks, funded by fertilizer interests, cautioned that Burkina Faso was promoting antagonism toward foreign partnerships. One European diplomat put it bluntly: "If Africa feeds itself with its waste, what exactly are we selling?" Washington was no less uneasy. Behind closed doors, agencies like USAID and the State Department flagged the initiative as a symbolic geopolitical realignment. Public silence masked private concern. For decades, agricultural aid had underpinned Western influence in the Sahel. If that architecture cracked, the balance of power would shift. "It is not the method," one analyst admitted. "It is the message: we don't need you." Meanwhile, outside Western capitals, the narrative sounded very different. Russian media hailed Project Oasis as a triumph of post-colonial ingenuity, likening it to Soviet-era resourcefulness. Chinese journals dissected the burial method, highlighting its potential for arid zones in Central Asia. Turkish outlets framed it as a marriage of modern science and ancestral wisdom. Each response revealed more about the observer than the experiment itself. Closer to home, the ripple effect became impossible to ignore. In Mali, radio hosts asked whether baobab pulp could serve the same purpose. In Niger, agricultural colleges held design contests for low-cost composting systems. In Chad, elders invited Burkina agronomists to demonstrate techniques. In Senegal, universities launched competitions for organic amendments inspired by the watermelon burial. Step by step, the idea of transforming waste into fertility was evolving into a regional experiment. What tied these reactions together was not only soil, but symbolism. The project had become a mirror in which different powers saw their own anxieties or aspirations. To the West, it signaled a challenge to markets and narratives. To others, it symbolized resilience, dignity, and a new pathway to ecological independence. And in West Africa itself, whispers of coordination began to surface. Could this be the seed of a broader Sahel Alliance, one not bound by external contracts, but united by local innovation? For Burkina Faso, the stakes were never only agronomic. They were existential. Every supportive headline from Bamako or Dakar was matched by another warning from Washington or Brussels. Every germinating seedling in the Sahel seemed to widen the gap between dependence and dignity. And as the seasons turned, the question became stark. Would Project Oasis remain a national experiment, or would it harden into a continental fault line that redrew alliances across Africa and beyond? As the buried melons decomposed, something larger was fermenting, an idea that refused to stay underground. Project Oasis was no longer measured only in moisture levels or germination rates. It was measured in the courage it gave to farmers, in the debates it provoked among politicians, and in the unease it sowed in distant capitals. Yet the path forward remains uncertain. Risks are real. Scientists warn that scaling burial methods without precision could invite pests, uneven nutrient release, or even methane emissions. Opposition leaders caution that symbolism must not eclipse science. Donor agencies whisper of aid withdrawals and shifting conditions. Every gain in the soil is matched by new storms above it. But opportunity is also undeniable. Households already report savings on fertilizer. Communities have transformed spoiled produce into microeconomies that fund schools and wells. Women's cooperatives and youth groups, once peripheral to agricultural planning, now stand at its center. What began as an experiment is becoming a new social contract, that resilience is not imported but cultivated. At the cultural level, the resonance deepens. Murals, songs, and slogans no longer speak of desperation but of determination. Graffiti proclaims, "We plant freedom." Farmers tell their children that spoiled fruit can awaken dead soil. Teachers remind pupils that the smallest acts can rewrite the largest narratives. Sovereignty, once a distant abstraction, has begun to take root as lived experience. The future of Project Oasis will depend on whether this momentum survives the pressures arrayed against it. Can Burkina Faso expand trials to mango skins, citrus peels, or livestock waste? Can monitoring systems keep pace with enthusiasm? Can local confidence withstand international campaigns of doubt? These questions extend beyond one country. Across the Sahel, farmers and leaders are watching closely. They see in Burkina Faso not a stunt, but a signal, that Africa's future may be written not in foreign boardrooms, but in the compost pits of its own markets. The region faces a choice: to replicate the model, to adapt it, or to let it wither under external pressure. For President Ibrahim Traoré's government, the gamble is immense. Success could ease dependence on imports, free millions of dollars for education and health, and carve a path toward genuine independence. Failure could reinforce skepticism and embolden critics who call the project reckless. The line between vision and vulnerability has never been so thin. But perhaps that is what makes Project Oasis so powerful. It is fragile, like a seed in dry soil. Yet within that fragility lies the possibility of harvest. The melons will rot away, but the question remains. Will the faith they planted endure long enough to transform not just fields, but the destiny of a nation? What began with spoiled fruit buried beneath the Sahel has grown into something far greater than agriculture. Project Oasis is no longer just about melons. It is about meaning. It is about whether sovereignty can sprout from waste, whether dignity can be cultivated in soils long declared barren, and whether Africa can finally escape the shadow of dependency. The images are unforgettable. Cracked earth holding moisture, millet pushing through dust, children calling the act of burial planting water. These are not statistics. They are signals. They tell us that resilience is possible when nations trust their own hands more than foreign contracts. For decades, Burkina Faso and its neighbors were told that salvation must come in shipments, fertilizers imported, aid conditioned, cycles of dependency reinforced. But the quiet defiance of Project Oasis has challenged that dogma. It has shown that survival does not have to be scripted elsewhere. It can be written in local innovation, in stubborn soil, in the courage to try what others mock. This is why the project matters far beyond Burkina Faso. To some, it is a glimpse of what African leadership truly looks like. Daring, experimental, imperfect, yet determined. To others, it is a warning that if Africa reclaims its fertility, entire industries and power structures may tremble. Across the region, talk of a Sahel Alliance rooted not only in security, but in ecological independence grows louder. And within this alliance lies the possibility of a different future, one where partnership replaces pity, where dignity outweighs dependency. The question is not whether the melons will decompose. They already have. The question is whether the belief they seeded can endure. Belief that sovereignty is not a gift but a harvest. Belief that dignity can emerge from the dust. Belief that Africa's path forward does not need permission. So we ask you, the viewer, is this merely a fleeting experiment or the beginning of a continental reawakening? If a simple watermelon can challenge billion-dollar markets, what might happen when a continent unites behind its own solutions? If this resonates with your vision of justice and hope, stay with us. Subscribe, share, and let your voice be part of this journey. Because sometimes the most radical act is not to wait, but to plant.